Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good everything, Thrive Alive family. My name is Jamillia Young, and today I'll be hosting an episode of Thrive Alive where we talk to Dr. Uchechi A Mitchell about stress. Dr. Uchechi Mitchell is an associate professor at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health in the Division of Community Health Sciences. She is a health disparities and minority aging researcher who addresses questions at the intersection of population and biopsychosocial sciences. She uses data from large national surveys of older adults to investigate pathways leading to late life racial and ethnic disparities in psychosocial outcomes, biomarkers, and supportive resources. A central theme throughout her research is an interest in the ways in which individual and community level stressors and coping processes shape health over the life course and contribute to our understanding of risk, resilience, and protective factors among older African Americans specifically. Okay, so for all of you at home who may not have followed or knew all of those words, I struggled myself with biopsychosocial, okay? Dr. Mitchell is going to help us break down all of these things through explaining some of her work. So welcome, Dr. Mitchell, to the show. We're so nice. We feel so nice to have you today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great, and thank you for having me. I'd love to talk about this stuff and really kind of get into the lived experiences of Black people and how we can, think about health equity, achieving health equity.
Okay, I appreciate that. So let's start out with some basics, okay? Could you tell us from a biological standpoint, what is stress?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. We hear the word a lot, and I don't think we fully comprehend what it is, but right. Stress is just your body's way of responding to a challenge, to something threatening, to something demanding. And we experience it throughout our days and throughout our lives. From a biological perspective, we often think about fight or flight, meaning you're faced with this challenge, your adrenaline raises, cortisol levels raise, and that leads to different changes in your body system. You start breathing faster, your heart rate picks up, you maybe start sweating, you get a little tense, and that's because you're trying to respond to the stressor that's in front of you and decide whether you should fight, right, or flee, right? Yeah. So all of these responses are protective, like we actually want them because it helps us focus in on the challenge and address the challenge. But they become detrimental for health if it's constant exposure to these stressful experiences. So
I appreciate that. Break down for our audience a little bit what the literature may say about African Americans or Black people in the U.S. period, right? And how stress may affect us differently than other groups.
Yeah, I think it's a good question to think about. And the question in particular, whether it's differently or whether it's more about the fact that we have different types of exposures and different levels of chronic exposure that can lead to increased risk for poor health outcomes. And so within the Black community, we often think about race and racism as a pervasive form of stress that manifests across the different levels, where there's interpersonal interactions or just thinking about navigating our healthcare system, education system, and kind of the biases we experience in those spaces. And even kind of thinking about kind of historical traumas and how they kind of transmit themselves across generations. So among Black people, we're really thinking about how these exposures over the life course and intergenerationally actually influence their ability to cope with other stressors or continued exposure to these stressors like discrimination or microaggressions. So it does lead to increased vulnerability to the stressors, meaning increased likelihood potentially of having these adverse outcomes. But it's because of the more chronic, more pervasive, and more severe forms of stress that Black people in general face. Okay,
so from what you are, telling me, that kind of contradicts a belief that people may have that it is something biologically, right, that would have us reacting differently than other groups. But it seems like what you're telling me is we are not biologically responding differently. It's just that the environment would expose us, right? Yes. Exposure is the word you use. Expose us to stress more often, chronically, right? Is what you're saying.
There is nothing about biology when we're in terms of biological differences across racial ethnic groups for us to understand health inequities and for us to understand why certain exposures or certain health outcomes are more prevalent in one group versus another. It is about the environments in which we are raised and navigate on a day-to-day basis, and the environments of the people that have come before us, and how that then kind of influences health as we go forward.
So talk to me a little bit about the intergenerational aspect of stress, right? Especially when we think about biology, right? So how can the stress of, say, my parent or my grandparent, right, affect me as I'm living on a biological level?
Yeah, so we should always think about health as a continuum across the life course, because everything that happens to us from conception, preconception to old age matters, right? And so the health of the mother, during pregnancy influences the health of the baby. And then the health of the mother's mother influences their experiences during pregnancy and life, and then also of the child. So there is, it's not the primary focus of my work, but there is literature suggesting that these traumas can get passed forward epigenetically. Meaning it's not about genes, but it's about how genes are transcribed and coded into different proteins and different substances in the body that influence kind of how we may respond to different conditions. So people talk about, how different, I don't know if I should go into all this, but just thinking about how epigenetic changes, so methylation of certain segments of our gene code, of our DNA can change the behavior of certain proteins in the body that then can have implications for how our body systems function. And so these happen in instances of trauma, right? And if we think about the experiences of Black people, enslaved Black people, and how that gets transmitted over generations, there is some reason to believe that there is this going on within the Black community, this intergenerational, this epigenetic kind of transmission of trauma, and how that then affects health and functioning.
I appreciate that. One of the things that maybe we still need a little bit of help understanding, right, is how does stress kind of impede the body's regular processes, right? So there's this term in the literature called allostatic load, right? Could you talk to us a little bit about how that's related to stress and the expression of chronic disease in our bodies?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a term that gets a lot of publicity nowadays.
Right.
So as I said earlier, stress is a natural process. It's something that we actually need. It's protective. It helps us, adapt to different situations. And what becomes problematic is when we are repeatedly exposed to these stressors without sufficient opportunity to recover from them. Or we recover, but because they're happening so frequently over the life course, our body just can't take it. So allostatic load is this notion of the wear and tear on our body. So this kind of tiring of our body systems such that they don't function as well as they could have and should have, or that we need them to as we kind of go forward. So if you can think about like this constantly kind of hitting up against a wall, and then eventually you're just so bruised and beaten that you can't function anymore. So that's kind of what our body is going through when we think about allostatic load, and it happens across all of our body systems. If you can think about constantly activating adrenaline and cortisol, there comes a point where that body system just can't take it anymore and starts slowing down production, or just stays at heightened levels. And so you don't see a recovery because it's just constantly being upregulated. We see that with inflammation, which is implicated in a lot of chronic diseases. Just the fact that you're constantly initiating this immune response and not giving your body a chance to like be free, to heal. So that is kind of the notion of allostatic load. Like, we need allostasis, which is our ability to kind of come back to normal levels. But once we kind of overtax our body systems, we don't come back to normal levels. We have high levels of inflammation. We have high blood pressure. We have high blood sugar because the stress has damaged our system so much that we can no longer come back to a normal level of functioning in our physiological system.
So, Dr. Mitchell, we started this podcast in part because when we went out into the community, the AFN's work has a lot to do with chronic conditions, right? And so we would encounter people in the community who would have high blood pressure, right? Who may have diabetes, right? Or other kinds of chronic conditions. And if we would check out, their vitals, they would be in ranges that would be a little alarming for us as researchers. And the folks that we would talk to, right, our participants, they would say, oh, I'm fine, or, oh, it's always like that, right? So when you were kind of speaking toward not being able to get back to that set point, I kind of thought about people who I have met in this work who may not be aware that their body is under stress. So with that being said, what are symptoms or signs of stress that people can easily ignore in their body or kind of wave away as being normal for them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's a part of why I do the research I do, where we think about stress and how it affects physiology before we get to the chronic condition. Because we can't necessarily feel immediately when our blood pressure starts to rise. But there are certain symptoms of being under stress that, as you stated, we can often ignore and think of as normal. So difficulty sleeping, right? Having migraines and headaches frequently. You can think about lack of focus and concentration, being fatigued. Like, these are kind of normal things, like, oh, I just had a rough day at work, or, I just ate something bad. So digestive issues are signs of stress. Like if you're having trouble with certain foods, or like more frequent trips to the restroom, stuff like that. So all of these things we just say, oh, this is just my body. And we all have different quirks and things and the way we function in life. But some of it is due to kind of repeated exposure to stress. I think the biggest example that we often think about is like, just take a breath, lower down your shoulders.
She caught me.
You don't even know that your shoulders are up at your ears, which is where you don't want them to be. So that's just like tension you hold in your muscles, tension you hold in your body that you don't necessarily see or think about consciously, because we're just going about our day, like trying to fix breakfast for our kids, trying to get to work on time, trying to finish a deadline, something for a deadline. And so we kind of ignore it and just like go to bed or try to go to bed. And then next thing you know, you're like, I'm feeling a little sleep deprived right now, and I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. I don't really know what it is, but that is kind of the physical manifestation of stress that is presenting what's going on internally within your body and your physiological systems.
I appreciate that. And in talking about, the practical kind of routine things that may get in the way of us being able to cope with stress, right? Could you tell us what are some practical things that you have found, either in your work or like through your research, that have helped people to cope with stress kind of over their life course?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think the ideal is to eliminate the stressor. That's like the first thing, whatever it is, right? It's better to kind of remove yourself from a stressful situation, or to change the environment so it's not as stressful. But if that's not the case, I mean, there are ways that we can cope both individually and collectively with the stressors we face. So I often think about, me talking with my girlfriends, right? That type of social and emotional support, and just having somebody that you can offload to a little bit, that has been shown in the literature to be protective, to minimize the amount of harm that a stressful experience can have generally. But there's also a lot of research, particularly within the Black community, about the role of religiosity, and not just in terms of like the social connection that can happen from attending religious services, but also thinking about kind of the messaging and how it helps you reframe some of the struggles that you are experiencing, so you don't maybe praise or think of the stressor as severely as it may be. Like you're able to kind of do maybe some sort of mental gymnastics, whatever you want to call it, to kind of get over the stressor and to kind of see it in a different way, to see it less as a threat and more as a challenge. And research does suggest that when you think about stressors that are more challenges versus threatening, you have different responses. Like challenges are something like, I'm going to challenge myself to run a marathon. And once you do that, you feel a lot of like pride, you feel a lot of positive outcomes, positive emotions, versus I'm under threat, my life is in danger. Those are two different types of stressors. And the latter one isn't as productive for growth and development compared to the thinking about stress as a challenge. And so when you think about kind of religiosity and religious texts and how it can reframe your thinking around the things that you're bearing, like that can be something that's positive. So that's more of kind of an internal way of trying to cope with it. Being positive, being hopeful, my research has shown it can mitigate the effects of discrimination. Thinking about older adults and when they experience stressful exposures, having a sense of purpose in life is something that can help mitigate its negative effects. So there's a lot of internal, like mental, emotional work we can do. There's also interpersonal work we can do, creating community among others. Then also just thinking kind of more broadly in neighborhoods and communities, that social cohesion, feeling that you have a space that you belong to can also be protective when we're trying to cope with stress.
I appreciate you talking about the different levels, right? In which health is kind of maintained, right? So like on that personal level, it's the way that I'm thinking, it's my mindset. Like how hopeful am I? And how confident am I, right? That this is a challenge that I can face, right? On that interpersonal level, right? Like seeking support. Could you talk to me a little bit more about how factors in one's neighborhood environment can contribute to stress and their ability to regulate their stress internally?
No, that's great. So yes, everything we experience, there's multiple levels to it. There's our own individual world, there's a world with our interaction with family and friends, and then there's kind of our larger community and neighborhood. And so our neighborhood is where we spend a good chunk of our time outside of work spaces. So all of the things that we experience in our neighborhoods matter for our health. And this goes along with thinking about social determinants of health, right? It's more than just our behavior. It's more than just, a healthcare system. It's actually what we're seeing and experiencing in the world. So we think about neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods that have been disinvested. They lack some of the resources that would be useful for maintaining health, but also have some exposures or elements and characteristics of those neighborhoods that can add to our stress burden, our stress load. So thinking about higher rates of crime, higher rates of violence, but also thinking about the lack of resources for, food access, thinking about, there's a new term going around about pharmacy deserts, like not being able to get your medications. Those are day-to-day stressors that people are navigating within their neighborhoods. And it's not because they don't want to go to the pharmacy, they don't want to go get healthy foods, because those resources aren't available. And then it becomes another thing, another challenge, another something for people to navigate in addition to just their regular lives. So when we think about our neighborhoods, there are places of both kind of some stressful exposures, as I've said, but there are also places of resources and community depending on where you are. So it's an interesting balance to kind of think about, like the social cohesion that comes from being in a neighborhood where you know your neighbors and know they got your back, but also realizing that through a lot of these kind of historical and structural factors, these neighborhoods are under-resourced and disinvested. and therefore it becomes even more challenging to meet basic needs. And so that's the important role that neighborhoods play.
I appreciate that. Again, talking about how interpersonally, I can know Miss Jones. I can check on her. The kids down the street, I can watch them as much as I can. But on a level where, as citizens, right, we don't necessarily control what's being put into our community. Even if we do care for each other in the ways that we can, we may be limited.
Yeah.
That's interesting, right? That is complicated.
Yeah, very.
Way more complicated than people want to give credit for sometimes.
Yeah.
And we're really interested in having you to break down for our audience what you found in your work that describes differences between how Black people of different ethnicities kind of are able to deal with stress, and also how we're exposed to stress. So the first thing, maybe it could be helpful, right? What is ethnicity, right? What is that?
That's a good question. That's what that is. I often think about ethnicity as culture, right? As kind of the norms and behaviors that are very specific to a group of people. And usually that group of people is defined by kind of where they live, where they've born, where they've been raised, and kind of speaks to nationality as well. So ethnicity is different than race, which we know is a socially constructed thing that's primarily defined based on kind of physical attributes. And among, racial groups that are defined in such a way, we have different ethnicities that represent different cultures and different ways of thinking, ways of life, et cetera, and different lived experiences and historical experiences that come to play in people's lives. So that's the best way I can think about it. But it is complicated to kind of tease it out. But hopefully that helps. I think ethnicity, culture, race is kind of just like this nebulous definition that we kind of use to define people that have similar physical attributes.
I think that will be helpful. Yeah. And so talk to us a little bit about how Black people of different ethnicities, right, different backgrounds, may be exposed to stress differently, or how we may respond to stress differently. And what are the implications, right, of these kinds of findings?
No, that's a great question. The first one about exposed differently, I wonder about that one, because if we think about within the context of the United States, to those who are not within the Black community, that nuance of ethnicity is lost.
Right.
It's like, you're just Black, you're Black, right? That nuance, until maybe there's an interaction and you learn somebody's history, then there might be differences. But from the outsider looking in, Black people are Black people, Black people. And therefore, the type of discrimination you'll experience is probably very similar. Although immigrant Blacks probably also face kind of immigration-related stressors, acculturation type stressors, meaning like how to kind of navigate and adapt to this new space, depending on how long they've been here. But I don't think those are things that other people that aren't in the community immediately recognize, right? So thinking in the context of discrimination and its effects on Black people, I think the levels of exposure in general have been shown to be similar, whether you're immigrant Black or Black American. But to the second part of your question, the response may be a little bit different, right, to those exposures. So some research that we have done has shown that when you're faced with discrimination and you actively try to cope or overcome it, that can be negatively have a negative impact for Black Americans that are born and have the history here within the U.S., but may actually be protective for Caribbean Blacks. And the ideal behind that, this high effort coping and why it might be negative, is that, again, maybe it's comparable to thinking about allostatic load. You are coping with discrimination that is pervasive, that is multi-level, and you're just constantly fighting. So the combination of this exposure of discrimination with this type of coping style just makes for a bad combination, right? And can lead to higher rates of hypertension or high probability or risk for hypertension. That's one of the findings that we have found. Whereas those who were Caribbean Black grew up in a space where they were the majority, right? They didn't have to necessarily experience kind of this constant fight against discrimination growing up, and are now faced with it now when they come to the US, but have different tools and resources available to cope with it. And so when they are actively trying to cope with discrimination, we've shown that they have lower probabilities of hypertension, that it is protective, this type of coping style. And I do think it's because the context in which they were raised is a little bit different. One where you are constantly the minority and from birth kind of experiencing this type of racial discrimination and racism, versus the context of like, I grew up in a Black majority country, right, in the Caribbean. And so I have other resources that elevate me, that support me, that affirm me. So when I face discrimination, one, I may not like actually recognize it as such because my experience has been so different. But two, I also have different resources I can mobilize in order to address it.
Okay, so, and again, this is going a little bit deeper, right? Because as we move forward and more people are moving, right? More so than we ever have before in history, there are more people who may be coming here to start their families, you know, people who are Black. And so what about their children, right? Children who are of a first generation background, you know, their parents may have came here from somewhere else. And they are born in America. They are raised in America as Black people, you know? So if you can kind of like pinpoint how their experiences may be different from those of a kind of immigration background, right? Someone who was born somewhere else and came here. And then also people whose families have been here for generations. Where would they fit inside of this?
No, that's great. It's complicated, as all your questions are. I mean, I'm trying to simplify it, but they're all very complicated and nuanced, but also beautiful in its complexity to try to think about. So I resonate because my parents were immigrants from Nigeria, and me and my siblings were raised here in the US. And then my children are like, you know, even more removed from a little bit of that Nigerian culture. And if you think about it, it's both, you know, for that generation, it's both thinking about like my parents' struggle as immigrants, right? And that kind of cultural kind of stress that can happen in terms of trying to navigate a new space. But then also kind of I'm viewed, as I said before, as Black, like Black people are Black people, Black people. And so then I'm also kind of dealing with kind of the racial discrimination that other Black folks deal with. So I think that nuance gets lost a lot. And I think it really does play out differently in terms of the health outcomes. And we do see that over generations, the health of the subsequent or the younger generations ends up being worse than their parents that immigrated into the US. And I do think it's, for example, my parents were raised in Nigeria. Again, they were not the minority. They did not have to deal with, you know, attacks on their identity because they were Black Nigerians in a Black country. And so they've developed certain resiliency around that they utilize here. And then for subsequent generations, you kind of lose that because you are born in a state where you are a minority in terms of number. And that matters for the types of resources you build, and so on and so forth. So I do think the literature suggests this is like a healthy immigrant effect. Like there's a healthy immigrant effect, like those who come over are healthier than those who do not. But then also over time that benefit, that boost kind of gets lost because of the environment in which you live in. And so that's kind of the key thing to think about there.
I appreciate that. Unfortunately, we do live in a time where divisive things, right, can be a little bit more to the forefront, right? And so I really do think that your work helps us to understand the way that we reflect each other's experiences, right? Because like you said, even if your parents would have a different position than you, right? Your children deserve to be able to build that resiliency, be able to build those internal resources in a way that can be lost, right? If we're not paying attention to how our cultures may be different and how they affect us. And I just want to make sure that our audience understands, in the context of what you're saying, what is resiliency?
Yes, that's also complicated. I mean, so we talked about coping, right? And that's kind of like, in the moment, there's a stressor. How am I dealing with it, right? What are the behaviors that I'm engaging in? What are the mindsets that I'm relying on? Who are the people I'm utilizing or kind of coming to for support? That's kind of coping. Resilience is a little bit deeper in that it's this overall kind of shift or growth or adaptation that happens over time, longer stretches of time. So not necessarily just in the moment, that really kind of shapes or defines your ability to navigate the situations you face. So it's allowed you to, at this, particularly I'm thinking about older adults at these older ages, to better deal with like those immediate, but also those kind of more long-term exposures that you've had. And so it's interesting because people talk about resilience as being like a trait, like you have to have grit. Like there's a whole book about it, which I haven't read, but I kind of move away from thinking about resilience as like a characteristic of a person and a little bit more of a process that unfolds over time. It's something that's developed through facing traumas, facing stressors, overcoming them and doing it again and again and again. So who you are when you started is a little bit different than where you are when you end. And so we can think about it kind of intergenerationally or across generations. If you think about older Black folk and how they grew up, some of them grew up during Jim Crow era, some of them grew up when there was overt racism that was very challenging to deal with, that I can't even imagine today as somebody younger and having not gone through it. So they've developed some resilience in that space because of these exposures that have allowed them to, in today's day and age, when they experience like discrimination at a restaurant or whatever, they're like, well, whatever, I've dealt with something even more severe in my past and I've overcome it and I'm here today despite it all. So I think there's something to say about the resilience of the Black community overall. If you think about kind of where we started as enslaved Blacks and then coming to age now and where we are today. I do also want to admit that there is controversy about the term resilience in that it's really, again, putting the onus on the person to be resilient. And again, that's why I steer clear from defining people or as resilient and trying to think about resilience as a process or as a community kind of effort. Because then the onus is on the person to overcome and be resilient, as opposed for us to kind of dismantle these systems and structures that are racist that really lead to the exposures that we're talking about. So there is that kind of debate, but I think it's just really trying to get at the strengths and the assets of the Black community that are utilized over time and that have led to the successes that we've seen within the community, despite all this attention that gets placed on health disparities and health inequities and poor health outcomes in the community.
I appreciate that. And I really do appreciate your commitment to looking at things at a higher level, right? Like at an upstream level where our society, and the world that we kind of inherit would be the first thing that you would want to look at if you want to look at why many people, right, are dealing with an issue.
Yes.
Commonly, and I think some people's experiences would reflect that the individual, right, like you're saying, if you just would have done this or do that, then you would be in a better place. But I think that the literature speaking to these upstream factors, right, the way that our society shapes our behavior is very illuminating, right? It's important. I appreciate you just talking us through some of these very high level concepts. We do understand through looking at the Chicago Department of Public Health's report on Black Chicagoans' health, that chronic disease, right, is one of the biggest factors that contributes to the life expectancy gap between Black Chicagoans and Chicagoans of other groups. So your work in this conversation has helped us kind of put in context, right, some of these neighborhood level factors and also some of these community level factors that would make it so that Black people in Chicago would live less, right, than other groups. I really appreciate that.
Yeah,
there's a lot of terms, a lot of breaking down, a lot of complications and nuance, but you did a great job in helping us to understand. Dr. Mitchell, I want to thank you again for coming into our studio today and helping us to understand stress and allostatic load. I want to know if you have any last words of wisdom for our audience as it relates to stress, coping, resiliency, any of those things.
Again, I don't know if these are words of wisdom, but I always kind of ground myself in history, and thinking about what people before me have gone through and what they've overcome. And for me, individually, that's kind of how I think about addressing my current stressors, my current exposures, the current discrimination that I face. And I draw strength on that. And I think if we all kind of hold on to that mindset, but also do so as a community and pull each other together, it's a lot easier to cope with the stressors that we face, right? It's a lot easier to move forward. And then my research has also kind of led me to really think about this intergenerational kind of transmission of resilience and strength and assets, because really there's a lot that we can learn from older Black people and all they've gone through, and that I can then pass on to my children. And I think if we do that more as a community, it's definitely a way for us to kind of navigate and address and overcome some of the current stressors that we are experiencing like today, right? So those are things that I ground myself with, that I found to be helpful. And again, just really trying to think about the assets within the community and how we can pull them all together to address some of the things that we struggle with.
I appreciate that. It reminds me of an Adinkra symbol. So the kind of Akan symbols, I believe, of where it's like present day Ghana. If you would like to Google it, it's ADI. I think it's NKRA, an Adinkra symbol. And so the Sankofa bird, right? Go back and get it, right? So go to the past to learn how did they do it, and then try to implement it into our present. So I think that is greatly wise.
Thank you.
Very timely. And I appreciate you sharing that with us.
Thank you. No, thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
Of course.
I love talking about this, and I'm glad people are interested in it because it's important and affects everything that we do and all the people that we love. So the more we can talk about stress in the Black community and how we can mitigate it, and the better, I think. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. I agree, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you all again for joining us. We have queued up some resources for you all to learn more about how stress can manifest in your body. In order to view these resources, you can go to www.AliveFaithNetwork.org/ThriveAlive. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. Hey, Thrive Alive family, this is Jamillia. We just wrapped the episode with Dr. Uchechi Mitchell at the University of Chicago talking about stress and allostatic load. We hope you enjoyed it. What we want you to do now is take 1 minute to fill out our Thrive Alive community survey. You can click the QR code on your screen or go to the link bit.ly/ThriveAliveSurvey to take our Thrive Alive community survey. We want to hear from you about what you learned from this episode and guests that you want to see in the future. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.